October 2nd, 1941. The vast plains south of Moscow tremble under a metallic dawn. Inside the steel belly of a Panzer IV, Captain Karl Weber presses his headset tighter against his ears as the static clears to reveal the order everyone has been waiting for. The engine roars to life, vibrating through the soles of his boots, joining a chorus of 2,000 other tanks stretching across the horizon. This is not merely an attack, but a tidal wave of armor designed to crush the heart of the Soviet Union. The operation is codenamed Typhoon, and the air smells of diesel, burnt cordite, and absolute confidence. The ground shakes as Army Group Center begins its surge forward, kicking up massive clouds of dust that choke the autumn sky. For the men inside these machines, the world is reduced to the view through a periscope and the crackle of the radio. They are the tip of the spear in the largest military offensive in human history, aiming to annihilate the remaining Soviet forces before the snow falls. Weber watches the infantry scramble alongside his tracks, their faces flushed with the adrenaline of the initial bombardment. There is no hesitation here, only the lethal efficiency of a war machine that has conquered Europe. Soviet defenses crumble almost instantly under the concentrated firepower of the German blitzkrieg. Artillery shells scream overhead, pulverizing the hastily dug trenches where terrified Red Army conscripts wait with obsolete rifles. The speed of the German advance is terrifyingly effective, bypassing strong points and severing communication lines before the Russian commanders even realize they are under attack. Reports flow back to headquarters describing panic and disarray among the enemy ranks. To the soldiers on the ground, it feels like the summer campaign all over again. A rapid chase across the steppes, where the only challenge is keeping the supply trucks fast enough to feed the tanks. Above the roaring tanks, the Luftwaffe dominates the skies with absolute authority. Messerschmitt fighters sweep the clouds clear of Soviet aircraft, while Heinkel bombers pound the retreating columns and rail junctions ahead. The air support is relentless, acting as flying artillery that smashes resistance before the ground troops even make contact. This vertical supremacy allows the panzer divisions to operate without fear of attack from above, a luxury that further fuels their confidence. The pilots report targets destroyed by the hundreds, their logs filling with the statistics of a massacre. It seems that nothing in the Russian arsenal can challenge German air power. General Heinz Guderian drives his Panzer Group II with relentless aggression, aiming to close the trap around the city of Bryansk. The strategy relies on the classic pincer movement, a maneuver the Wehrmacht has perfected from Warsaw to Paris. Maps in the command tents show blue arrows sweeping deep behind the Soviet lines, threatening to entrap immense armies in a cauldron of fire. The coordination between the Luftwaffe dive bombers and the ground forces is seamless. Stuka sirens wail from the clouds, descending like birds of prey to blast any Soviet column attempting to retreat or regroup against the onslaught. Within days, the encirclement at Vyazma and Bryansk yields a staggering number of prisoners, creating a spectacle of defeat that reinforces the German sense of superiority. Columns of captured Soviet soldiers stretch for miles, trudging westward with heads bowed, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. It looks like the total collapse of the Red Army is at hand. Just as the intelligence officers predicted, soldiers like Weber snap photographs of the devastation, believing they are documenting the final days of the war. The mood is electric with victory, and the road to Moscow seems to lie open, practically undefended and waiting for the conquerors. This overwhelming success breeds a dangerous complacency within the highest levels of the German high command. Hitler and his generals convince themselves that the enemy is broken and incapable of operational recovery. Consequently, the urgent requests for winter clothing and antifreeze are deprioritized in favor of ammunition and fuel for the advance. The logistical trains are packed with shells to finish the job. Not greatcoats for a long winter they do not believe will happen. They assume the campaign will end in weeks, long before the bitter Russian frost becomes a tactical reality. It is a calculation based on arrogance rather than meteorology. For the infantry marching behind the tanks, the days are long and physically exhausting, yet morale remains surprisingly high. They march 20 or 30 miles a day, their boots kicking up the dry dust of the Russian roads. In the evenings, they sit around field kitchens eating hot stew, writing letters to wives and mothers promising a return by Christmas. The rumors fly through the ranks that Moscow is already evacuating. that the government is fleeing, and that the war is practically won. They sleep in the open or in captured barns, unaware that the clear autumn nights are slowly growing longer and colder. As the Wehrmacht advances, they move through a landscape that is being systematically destroyed by the retreating Soviets. Stalin has issued orders to leave nothing behind for the invaders. Villages are set ablaze. Bridges are blown into the rivers, and grain stores are torched. The horizon is often stained with the black smoke of these fires, a grim reminder of the total nature of this war. The German soldiers look upon this destruction with a mix of awe and contempt, seeing it as the desperation of a dying regime. They do not yet understand that this scorched earth will soon leave them without shelter. Yet, amidst the collapsing front, there are ominous signs that the fighting spirit of the Soviet soldier has not been entirely extinguished. Isolated units fight to the death, refusing to surrender even when bypassed and cut off from support. The appearance of the T-34 tank sends shockwaves through the German armoured divisions, as its sloped armour deflects shells that would penetrate any other vehicle. These encounters are brief but violent, serving as a warning that the enemy still possesses teeth. Captain Weber watches a shell bounce off a Soviet hull and feels a flicker of unease beneath the triumphant narrative of the advance. The deeper the Wehrmacht pushes into the vastness of Russia, the thinner the supply lines become. The standard gauge of the European railways does not match the wider Russian tracks, forcing a massive transshipment effort that slows the flow of goods. Trucks break down on the rough dirt roads, and spare parts are becoming as valuable as gold. The drivers fight against fatigue and mechanical failure to keep the fuel moving forward to the thirsty panzers. The momentum of the offensive is maintained only by straining the logistical system to its absolute breaking point. It is a fragile lifeline stretching back hundreds of miles. Despite these friction points, the objective remains tantalizingly close. The spires of the Kremlin are the ultimate prize, the symbol of the Bolshevik regime that must be toppled. Commanders look at their maps and measure the distance in hours rather than days. The psychological pull of the capital acts like a magnet, drawing the entire army forward with a singular focus. Every soldier knows that taking Moscow means the end of the hardships, a warm billet, and the glory of final victory. They push their machines harder, ignoring the warning lights on their dashboards and the weariness in their bones. Back at the headquarters of Army Group Center, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock studies the maps with intense focus. The operational arrows are moving according to schedule, yet he feels the pressure of the calendar. He knows that the window for mobile warfare is closing. His reports to Berlin are optimistic, masking the underlying anxiety about the supply situation. He pushes his subordinates to drive their men harder, demanding that they reach the outer defensive ring of Moscow within the week. The command tents are hives of activity, with teleprinters chattering orders that will send thousands of men to their deaths in the mud. Around the middle of October, the weather begins to shift in subtle ways that the confident invaders largely ignore. The bright sun of early autumn is replaced by heavy, low-hanging grey clouds that obscure the Luftwaffe's air support. A cold wind begins to blow from the north, stripping the last leaves from the birch trees and sending a chill through the standard-issue summer uniforms. The dust that has plagued the advance for weeks begins to settle, dampened by a persistent, light drizzle. It is not yet a storm, just a change in the atmosphere that hints at the turning of the season. The tank commanders notice the change first as the ground beneath their treads begins to soften. The distinct crunch of dry earth is replaced by a squelch, though the panzers still move with relative ease. They do not yet realize that the soil of this region is peculiar, composed of a loam that transforms dramatically when wet. For now, it is merely a nuisance, a bit of mud on the tracks and boots. The German High Command orders the advance to continue at full speed, racing against time. They believe they can beat the weather. Unaware that the geography itself is about to declare war, the soldiers check their equipment. Satisfied with the precision of their Kar-9 8K rifles and the reliability of their MG-34 machine guns, however, a closer look reveals the gaps in their preparedness for a sustained campaign. Their boots are hobnailed, excellent for marching on European cobblestones but prone to conducting freezing temperatures directly into the foot. Their greatcoats are stylish but thin, designed for the temperate climates of France and Poland. There are no felt boots, no fur-lined parkas, and no white camouflage smocks. The army is dressed for a victory parade in Berlin, not a survival struggle in the frozen wastes of Russia. As the first real rain begins to fall on the evening of October 6th, the great offensive is still moving, but the friction is palpable. The illusion of invincibility is intact, yet it is brittle. Captain Weber looks out from his turret as the horizon turns a bruised purple. He wipes a smear of oil from his face, feeling the first true bite of the cold wind. The German war machine has reached its zenith, poised to strike the final blow. But unknown to them, the easy days are over, the dust has settled, and the season of mud is about to begin. The drizzle that began as a nuisance in early October soon transforms into a torrential downpour that seems determined to wash the German army off the face of the earth. The sky turns a slate grey, hanging low and heavy over the invaders, releasing sheets of freezing rain that blur the horizon and soak the uniforms of every soldier within hours. It is relentless, continuing day after night, turning the very landscape into a hostile liquid entity. The dusty roads, which had supported the thunderous advance of the panzers only days before, undergo a horrific chemical change. They dissolve completely, losing all structural integrity and becoming deep, treacherous rivers of sludge. This is the Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads, a phenomenon legendary in Russian history but woefully underestimated by the German planners in Berlin. The soil here acts like a sponge, swelling with water until it becomes a sticky, viscous glue that grips everything it touches. It is not merely wet dirt, but a deep, sucking quagmire that pulls boots off feet and swallows wheels up to the axles. The grand strategy of rapid encirclement, reliant on speed and maneuverability, slams into a wall of mud. The blitzkrieg, a doctrine predicated on lightning-fast movement, grinds to a halt not by enemy fire, but by the geography itself. For the logistical drivers attempting to supply the front, the situation is a nightmare of epic proportions. The Opel Blitz trucks, the workhorses of the Wehrmacht supply chain, prove utterly unsuited for these conditions. Their narrow tires slice into the muck and spin uselessly, digging their own graves in the mire. Convoys that once covered 50 miles a day now struggle to move 5. Drivers weep with frustration as they spend hours pushing vehicles a few yards, only to have them sink again. The lifeline of fuel and ammunition to the forward units begins to strangle, causing the pulse of the offensive to flutter and fade. A vast portion of the German army is still horse-drawn, a fact often obscured by the propaganda reels of tanks and aircraft. Hundreds of thousands of horses struggle through the sludge, dragging artillery pieces and supply wagons. The suffering of these animals is pitiful to witness. They strain until their hearts burst, collapsing into the mud where they are often shot and left to rot, or butchered for meat by hungry soldiers. The roads become graveyards for horses and machines alike, littered with the detritus of a stalled army. The stench of death begins to mingle with the smell of wet wool and unburnt diesel. To keep moving, the engineers are forced to build corduroy roads, a painstaking process of laying thousands of tree trunks side by side across the mud to create a stable surface. It is back-breaking labor that consumes entire forests and countless man-hours. Infantrymen, who should be fighting, are instead turned into lumberjacks and road builders. They wade through freezing slime that reaches their knees, their hands raw and blistered, laying logs in an endless, rhythmic struggle against the earth. Even these makeshift roads are treacherous, as the logs become slick with oil and mud, causing trucks to slide off into the ditches where they are abandoned. The panzer divisions, the iron fist of the assault, find themselves neutralized by the terrain. The heavy tanks, which terrified the world with their mobility, are now reduced to steel bunkers sinking under their own weight. Fuel consumption skyrockets as engines idle for hours or rev frantically in low gear trying to break free from the suction. A tank that normally travels 100 miles on a tank of gas now burns that same amount to move 10 miles. Commanders watch their fuel gauges drop with a sense of dread, knowing that the tankers behind them are stuck miles away in a traffic jam that stretches to the horizon. Meanwhile, the Soviet T-34 tanks demonstrate their superior design for this specific environment. Their wider tracks distribute the vehicle's weight more effectively, allowing them to glide over the mud that traps the German panzers. This technical advantage allows the Red Army to launch stinging local counterattacks, hitting the immobilized German columns and vanishing before a response can be organized. The German crews curse their narrow tracks and the complex suspension systems that clog with mud and freeze at night. They are sitting ducks, trapped in their steel coffins, watching the enemy maneuver with frustrating ease. The halt-in-the-ground advance is mirrored in the sky. The forward airfields, which the Luftwaffe needs to support the attack on Moscow, turn into lakes of mud. Messerschmitts and Stukas sit grounded, their wheels sunk deep into the earth, unable to take off. The relentless air cover that protected the German troops for 2 years suddenly vanishes. For the first time, the Soviet Air Force begins to contest the airspace, strafing the stalled columns that are lined up bumper to bumper on the few remaining roads. The German soldiers look up, waiting for the familiar roar of their own planes, but hear only the rain and the enemy engines. Inside the command tents, the mood shifts from arrogance to frantic improvisation. Maps that showed clear highways to Moscow are now useless, as those highways simply do not exist in reality. General Guderian and his peers rage against the weather, sending furious messages to Berlin, demanding solutions that do not exist. They are forced to make impossible choices about what to bring forward. Do they prioritize shells to fight the enemy, or fuel to move the vehicles, food for the men, or fodder for the horses? Every decision is a gamble with lives, and every delay gives the Soviets more time to strengthen the capital's defenses. The physical toll on the infantry is catastrophic, drenched to the bone and unable to dry their clothes. The men begin to suffer from trench foot and dysentery. There are no dry billets in the burned-out villages, so they sleep in waterlogged foxholes or under leaking tarpaulins. The damp cold saps their energy and lowers their immune systems, leading to a spike in sickness that thins the ranks as effectively as machine gun fire. The camaraderie of the early victories is replaced by a grim determination to simply survive the day. They are no longer marching to glory, they are slogging through hell. As the advance crawls, the soldiers develop a grim gallows humor about General Mudd, the new commander of the Soviet forces. They joke that the mud is a secret weapon developed by Stalin, more effective than any tank or cannon. But beneath the jokes lies a deep, gnawing anxiety. They know that every day spent stuck in the mud is a day lost before the winter truly hits. They look at the grey sky and pray for the ground to freeze, believing that the frost will be their salvation. They wish for the cold to return the mobility to their tanks, unaware of what that cold will actually bring. In Moscow, the pause caused by the mud is viewed as a miracle. It buys the desperate defenders precious weeks to dig anti-tank ditches and build barricades. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, mostly women and teenagers, are mobilized to dig earthworks in the rain. They work until they collapse, driven by fear and patriotism, turning the outskirts of the city into a fortress. Fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East begin to arrive by rail, debarking in the rear and moving into position. While the Germans are stuck spinning their wheels, the Soviet hammer is slowly being raised for a strike. The communication lines, stretched thin by the rapid advance, now begin to fail completely. Dispatch riders on motorcycles cannot navigate the sludge, and radio equipment malfunctions in the constant damp. Units find themselves isolated in the vast Russian landscape, unsure of where the enemy is or where their own support lies. The cohesive, well-oiled machine of the Wehrmacht begins to fragment into disjointed groups of men fighting their own private wars against the elements. The strategic picture becomes a blur to the commanders, who are essentially blind in the storm. By late October, the Great Offensive has not just slowed, for all practical purposes. It has stopped. The spearheads are stuck miles from their objectives, low on fuel and ammunition. The German High Command faces a critical dilemma: halt the offensive to build up supplies and risk winter arriving, or push on with exhausted troops and risk total collapse. Driven by the political necessity of taking Moscow and the belief that the Soviets are on their last legs, they choose to push. It is a decision made on maps in warm rooms, far removed from the misery of the mud-soaked reality on the ground. Finally, in the first days of November, the temperature drops sharply. The rain turns to sleet, and then to snow. The mud, which has held the army captive for weeks, begins to harden into solid ridges of frozen earth. The soldiers cheer as the tanks lurch forward, their tracks biting into the hard ground once more. The engines roar, and the advance resumes. They believe the worst is over, that the freeze is their ally. But as the thermometer continues to plummet, they are about to discover that the mud was only the purgatory before the hell of the deep winter. November arrives not with a whimper, but with the snap of a freezing wind that instantly hardens the liquid misery of the previous weeks. Overnight, the vast swamps of mud that had swallowed the Wehrmacht's momentum transform into a landscape of jagged, frozen ridges. To the tank commanders and truck drivers, this sudden solidification feels like a divine deliverance, a second chance granted by fate. The engines roar to life, and the tracks clatter loudly over the rock-hard earth. Kicking up chips of frozen soil instead of slop, the logistical arteries unclog, and for a fleeting moment, the German army believes that the blitzkrieg has been resurrected from its muddy grave. However, this renewed mobility comes at a terrifying price that becomes apparent as the mercury continues its relentless descent. The temperature drops to 0, then 10 below, plunging the region into a deep freeze that the Central European invaders are entirely unequipped to handle. The General Mud that had stalled them has been replaced by an even more ruthless commander, General Winter. The initial relief of movement is quickly replaced by the stinging realization that the hard ground is merely the floor of a rapidly cooling freezer. The cold is not just a weather condition, it is a physical assault on the body, penetrating every layer of inadequate clothing the soldiers possess. The German soldier stands on the frozen steppe, dressed for a parade in Paris, not a survival struggle in the Russian interior. His uniform is a masterpiece of smart tailoring, designed to look imposing, but it is made of cotton and thin wool that offers virtually no insulation against sub-zero winds. Underneath, he wears standard underwear, with no thermal layers to trap body heat. The most critical failure lies in the footwear, the iconic jackboots. While durable, they are fit tight to the calf, restricting circulation, and their soles are studded with iron hobnails. These metal nails act as perfect conductors, sucking the heat from the soldier's feet and channeling the freezing cold of the ground directly into his bones. As the columns press forward toward Moscow, the landscape turns into a blinding white void that exposes the tactical negligence of the high command. There are no winter camouflage smocks available for the troops, leaving them as stark, dark silhouettes against the pristine snow. They are perfect targets for Soviet snipers, standing out like ink blots on a blank page. To compensate, soldiers desperately scavenge for anything white, tearing up bedsheets from abandoned farmhouses or even painting their helmets with whitewash. It is a ragged, improvised army that marches east, stripped of its professional veneer and reduced to a collection of shivering men trying to blend into the hostile terrain. The logistical failure regarding winter clothing is not an accident but a calculated gamble that has spectacularly backfired. In the months prior, supply trains were packed exclusively with ammunition and fuel, prioritizing the weight of attack over the well-being of the troops. The quartermaster general had flagged the need for winter gear, but the high command, drunk on their own optimism, dismissed the warnings, convinced the war would be over before the first snowflake fell. Now, thousands of tons of heavy wool coats and felt boots sit in depots in Poland and Germany, hundreds of miles away, while the men at the front wrap newspapers around their torsos in a futile attempt to stay warm. The health of the army begins to deteriorate with alarming speed as the cold weakens their immune systems. Dysentery, a plague that ran rampant during the muddy season, becomes a lethal sentence in the freezing temperatures. A soldier forced to drop his trousers in 20 below weather risks rapid hypothermia or frostbite in the most sensitive areas. The field hospitals are overwhelmed not with combat wounds, but with cases of severe trench foot and exposure. Surgeons work in unheated tents where the blood freezes on their instruments, often performing amputations on black, gangrenous toes that have been destroyed by the soldiers' own boots. In stark contrast, the Red Army soldiers they encounter are dressed for the environment, appearing like comfortable bears in the snow. They wear the telegrika, a quilted, padded jacket and trouser set that traps heat effectively, and the valenki, thick felt boots that keep feet warm even in the deepest drifts. When German soldiers capture Soviet positions, they do not search for intelligence or gold. They strip the dead of their boots and coats. It is a grim admission of inferiority, where the master race is forced to clothe itself in the uniforms of the subhuman enemy just to survive the night. Despite the freezing agony, the order remains to attack, and the pincers slowly close in on the Soviet capital. General Guderian's tanks push from the south towards Tula, an industrial city that serves as the southern anchor of Moscow's defense. The ground is hard enough for maneuvers, but the fighting is savage. The Soviets have fortified the city, and the German infantry is forced to assault prepared positions in temperatures that jam their rifles. Every breath is a struggle. The air so cold it feels like inhaling broken glass, burning the lungs and sapping the energy required to sprint from cover to cover. The days grow incredibly short, with darkness swallowing the afternoon by 3:00 p.m., extending the misery of the freezing nights. Sleep becomes a dangerous game. To fall asleep in the open without waking up to move is to risk never waking up at all. Sentries have to be rotated every 30 minutes to prevent them from freezing to death at their posts. Entire squads huddle together in human piles inside ruined buildings, sharing body heat in a desperate communal effort to keep the blood flowing. The discipline of the drill square evaporates, replaced by the primal instinct of the pack trying to outlast the elements. The psychological toll of the white wasteland begins to weigh heavily on the minds of the men. The endless, repetitive landscape of snow and birch trees offers no mental respite, inducing a condition the doctors call snow melancholia. Soldiers stare into the distance with the 1,000-yard stare, their minds numbed by the monotony and the constant, gnawing cold. The confidence of October is gone, replaced by a fatalistic dread. They feel small and insignificant against the vastness of Russia, which seems to be actively trying to kill them with its climate alone. As November progresses, the cold brings with it a new, invisible enemy lice. The inability to wash or change clothes for weeks allows the parasites to infest the entire army, thriving in the warmth of the unwashed bodies beneath the layers of wool. The itching is maddening, a constant torture that denies the exhausted men any rest. Worse, the lice carry typhus, a fever that begins to spread through the ranks. The German army is rotting from within, filthy, freezing, and infested, a shadow of the gleaming legions that marched into Poland 2 years prior. Yet, the proximity to Moscow acts as a tantalizing drug for the commanders who are not suffering in the foxholes. They can see the golden domes on their maps, mere dozens of miles away. They push the exhausted units for one last heave, believing that the Soviet defense is brittle and one hard shove will shatter it. They ignore the reports of frostbite casualties, viewing them as statistical anomalies rather than a systemic collapse. Field Marshal von Bock is obsessed, driven by a nervous energy, demanding advances even as his own officers beg to halt and dig in for the winter. The equipment, like the men, begins to show the first signs of rebelling against the temperature, while the tanks can move on the hard ground. The lubricants and oils used in the engines are not formulated for extreme cold. Drivers have to light fires under the oil pans of their trucks every morning just to liquefy the sludge enough to start the engines. It is a dangerous ritual that wastes precious fuel and risks detonating the vehicles. The sophisticated German engineering, built for the temperate precision of Western Europe, is being defeated by the brute force of the Russian climate. Interaction with the Russian civilian population becomes increasingly brutal as the desperation for warmth overrides all other moral codes. German units entering villages evict entire families into the snow, taking their wooden Izba houses for shelter. They dismantle barns, fences, and even furniture to feed the voracious fires needed to keep from freezing. The war of ideologies dissolves into a war for resources: a coat, a felt boot, a warm stove. The soldiers take what they need with the ruthless efficiency of dying men, leaving a trail of frozen corpses among the civilians in their wake. By the end of November, the trap has fully snapped shut, though the German High Command refuses to acknowledge it. The ground has hardened, yes, but it has locked them into a theatre of war where they are physically inferior to their environment. They have advanced closer to Moscow, but they have stretched their supply lines to the breaking point in weather that kills the unprepared. The Wehrmacht is now a brittle sword, frozen solid, hacking away at a stone wall. They are standing at the gates of the capital, But as the temperature drops further towards the absolute zero of deep winter, they are about to discover that they are not the besiegers, but the victims. It is early December, and the thermometer has shattered all logic. Plunging to 40 degrees below zero, the air itself seems to crystallize, hanging in a frozen fog that obscures the sun and burns the skin upon contact like a chemical agent. This is not merely winter, it is a planetary hostility that defies human survival. A cold so absolute that it changes the physics of the battlefield, for the German soldiers shivering in their foxholes. The concept of warmth has become a distant memory, a dream from another life. The metal of their weapons is so cold that touching it with bare skin tears the flesh away, bonding man to machine in a gruesome fusion of ice and blood. Through the haze of the freezing mist, the forward observers can see it, tantalizing and cruel. The golden domes of the Kremlin glint weakly in the pale light, perhaps only 12 miles away. Officers stare through their binoculars, their breath forming instant clouds of ice. Mesmerized by the spires of the city they have marched 2,000 miles to conquer, it is right there, the heart of the Soviet beast, visible to the naked eye. Yet, this proximity is a psychological torture, as the distance is measured not in miles, but in the impossible effort required to move frozen limbs and dead engines across the killing fields. The vaunted German technology, the pride of the Reich and the envy of the world, begins to fail catastrophically in these extreme conditions. When a soldier pulls the trigger of his Kar-98K rifle, nothing happens. The gun oil has turned into a sticky paste, gluing the firing pin mechanism shut. Machine guns jam instantly, their precision parts unable to tolerate the thermal contraction of the steel. In a panic, the infantrymen resort to urinating on the breeches of their weapons to thaw them out for a few seconds of firing. It is a desperate, humiliating improvisation that highlights how the advanced machinery of war has been humbled by the primitive power of nature. The artillery batteries fall silent, not because they lack shells, but because the recoil fluid in the barrels has frozen solid. If fired, the guns would explode, killing their crews instantly. The tanks are no better. To start a Panzer IV now requires a campfire to be built directly under the hull, roasting the engine block for hours to liquefy the oil. Even then, the rubber on the road wheels has become brittle as glass, shattering into chunks as the tracks turn. The mighty blitzkrieg, built on speed and maneuverability, is now a collection of frozen statues scattered across the white steppe, waiting to be buried by the next blizzard. For the men, the suffering transcends the boundaries of human endurance. Frostbite moves through the ranks like a silent plague, turning toes, fingers, and noses black with gangrene. There is no morphine left to dull the pain, and the frozen ground makes it impossible to dig graves for the dead. Corpses are stacked like cordwood behind the lines, preserved perfectly in the deep freeze, their eyes often left open, staring blankly at the grey sky. Survivors wrap themselves in layers of stolen curtains, women's shawls, and straw, looking more like medieval scarecrows than the disciplined soldiers who conquered France just a year prior. The supply situation has devolved from critical to non-existent. The trains are stuck miles back, their locomotives frozen on the tracks, and the horse-drawn columns have ceased to function as the animals die in droves. Bread arrives at the front as frozen bricks that must be chopped with axes and thawed in the mouth before they can be swallowed. Hot food is an impossibility. By the time a mess tin travels from the field kitchen to the foxhole, the soup is a block of ice. The soldiers gnaw on hardtack and frozen horse meat, their bodies consuming their own muscle mass just to generate enough metabolic heat to stay alive. A reconnaissance battalion from the 2nd Panzer Division manages to reach the town of Khimki, just 5 miles from the outskirts of Moscow. They are so close they can see the flashes of the electric tram lines in the city center and the towers of the Kremlin through their optics. It is the high water mark of the invasion, the closest any German soldier will ever get to the capital. But they are a ghost unit, running on fumes and adrenaline, isolated and unsupported. They look at the city not with the hunger of conquerors, but with the weary resignation of men who know they have reached the end of their tether. While the Germans freeze, the Soviet resistance stiffens, emboldened by the weather that is their birthright. The Red Army soldiers, clad in their thick sheepskins and felt boots, move with an agility that seems supernatural to the shivering invaders. Their weapons, designed with looser tolerances, continue to fire in the sub-zero temperatures. They launch sudden, stinging raids on ski troops, gliding silently out of the white gloom to massacre a frozen outpost and vanish before a defense can be organized. To the Germans, these white-clad figures are like phantoms of the snow, immune to the cold that is killing the Wehrmacht. Back at the headquarters, the disconnect between the orders and the reality is total. Field Marshal von Bock is physically shaking, his health collapsing under the stress. Yet he telephones his commanders, screaming for one last push. He orders men who cannot feel their feet to march into heavy machine gun fire. The generals on the ground listen to these orders with disbelief, looking at their thermometers and their dying men. The chain of command is straining, as the loyalty to the Führer clashes with the basic instinct of self-preservation. They are being asked to do the impossible with absolutely nothing. Evacuating the wounded becomes a death sentence. The plasma bottles freeze and burst before they can be administered, and bandages freeze hard as rock, becoming impossible to apply. A wounded man left in the open for 10 minutes is a dead man. The ambulances are stuck in the drifts, their engines dead. Many soldiers, knowing that a wound means a slow, freezing death, choose to keep fighting or simply huddle in their holes, hoping for a quick end. The medical system has collapsed, leaving the injured to the mercy of the merciless Russian winter. The mental state of the army shifts from anxiety to a profound, icy apathy. The grand ideological crusade against Bolshevism has been reduced to a singular, animalistic desire for warmth. Soldiers no longer care about victory or defeat. They care only about the fire. They burn furniture, books, and even the wooden stocks of their rifles if it buys them 5 minutes of heat. The discipline that held the army together is being eroded by the cold. Officers find their men comatose, huddled together in snow dugouts, refusing to move even when threatened with court-martial, surrendering to the sleep of hypothermia. The spires of Moscow remain visible, mocking the dying army. They stand as a symbol of the strategic failure, a prize that is physically close but operationally unreachable. The German commanders realize too late that the map is not the territory. On the map, they are inches away. On the ground, they are separated by an infinite wall of ice and resistance. The realization settles in that they will not be sleeping in the Kremlin tonight, nor any night soon. The attack has culminated. The spring of the blitzkrieg has been wound too tight. And now, in the frozen wastes of Khimki, it snaps. As the sun sets on December 4th, the temperature plunges even further, hitting a record low. The German army is frozen in place, a statue of ice poised with a dagger at Moscow's throat. But the arm holding the dagger is dead. Silence falls over the front, broken only by the howling wind, unseen by the shivering sentries. Deep behind the Soviet lines, massive engines are roaring to life. The Siberian divisions are moving into their jump-off positions. The Germans are frozen at the gates, unaware that the gates are about to burst open. The dawn of December 5th breaks over the frozen landscape with a deceptive quiet. The German lines, stretched thin across the perimeter of Moscow like a brittle wire, are silent. Sentries stare blankly into the white haze, their senses dulled by the unrelenting cold and the weeks of accumulated exhaustion. German intelligence officers in the rear have assured the frontline commanders that the Red Army is effectively finished. They report that Stalin has depleted his last reserves and that the enemy possesses no capability for a large-scale counterattack. This assessment is accepted as gospel by the High Command, a comforting lie that allows them to believe the war is paused only by the weather. However, a massive geopolitical gamble has already taken place in the shadows, one that will seal the fate of the Operation Typhoon. Months prior, a German spy in Tokyo named Richard Sorge sent a critical message to the Kremlin confirming that Japan had decided to strike south against the United States and the British Empire, rather than attacking the Soviet Union. This vital intelligence allowed Stalin to strip the Soviet Far East of its defenses. For weeks, the Trans-Siberian Railway has been thrumming with activity, transporting the hardened divisions of the Siberian military district westward, straight into the heart of the storm. These are not the terrified conscripts the Germans slaughtered in October. The Siberian troops are elite soldiers, born and bred in the harshest climates on Earth. They step off the trains fully equipped for winter warfare, wearing thick sheepskin coats, fur caps, and felt boots that keep their feet warm in 40-degree frost. They are well fed, rested, and armed with automatic weapons that function in the cold. More importantly, they are masters of winter camouflage and ski tactics. While the Germans freeze in their summer uniforms, the Siberians blend invisibly into the snow, moving with a lethal energy that the invaders can no longer match. General Georgy Zhukov, the savior of Leningrad and now the defender of Moscow, has secretly massed these fresh forces on the flanks of the overextended German armies. He has hidden entire armies in the forests and ravines, masking their movement under the cover of the long winter nights and the heavy cloud cover that grounded German reconnaissance planes. His plan is not merely to stop the Germans, but to destroy them. He intends to strike exactly when the enemy is at their weakest point, paralyzed by the cold and logistical collapse. The trap is set, the spring is coiled, and the German commanders remain blissfully unaware of the sledgehammer hovering above their heads. The attack begins not with a whimper, but with a roar that shakes the icicles from the trees. At dawn on December 5th, the Soviet artillery opens fire along a massive front, shattering the freezing silence. Thousands of guns, mortars, and rocket launchers unleash a barrage that pulverizes the shallow German foxholes. The ground erupts in geysers of snow and frozen earth, burying men who are too stiff to run. The psychological impact is immediate and devastating. The Germans, expecting a quiet winter stalemate, wake up to an apocalypse of fire and steel that signals the beginning of a new phase of the war. Out of the smoke and the swirling snow, the Siberian infantry attacks. They do not walk, they glide. Battalions of ski troops sweep across the open fields, moving fast and low, presenting difficult targets for the sluggish German gunners. They appear like ghosts in their white camouflage smocks, invisible until the muzzle flashes of their PP-4 submachine guns light up the gloom. They bypass strong points, infiltrate rear areas, and strike command posts before the Germans even realize the line has been breached. The mobility of the ski troops allows them to dominate the terrain that has trapped the Wehrmacht. Alongside the infantry, the T-34 tanks roar into action, their wide tracks churning through the deep snow that has immobilized the panzers. To the horror of the German anti-tank crews, their shells bounce harmlessly off the sloped armor of the Soviet machines. The 37mm anti-tank guns, nicknamed door knockers by the troops, prove useless against the charging T-34 seconds. The Soviet tanks overrun the German positions, crushing guns and freezing infantry under their treads. For the first time in the war, the German soldier feels a profound sense of technological inferiority as his weapons fail against the steel monsters emerging from the blizzard. In a terrifying throwback to an older era of warfare, the Soviet cavalry joins the assault. Major General Lev Dovata's Cossacks charge out of the forests. Their horses conditioned to the harsh winter, they strike fear into the hearts of the infantry, galloping across ground where trucks and tanks cannot move. The Cossacks use the deep snow to flank the German units, descending on supply columns and isolated outposts with sabers drawn. The sight of thousands of horsemen charging through the mist is a surreal nightmare for the freezing Germans, a chaotic blend of modern industrial slaughter and ancient fury. Panic begins to spread through the German ranks like a contagion. The vaunted discipline of the Wehrmacht, already eroded by the misery of the winter, cracks under the pressure of the fresh assault. Officers scream orders that are swallowed by the wind or ignored by men who are focused solely on survival. Radios crackle with desperate pleas for reinforcements, only to be told that there are none. The realization hits every soldier from the private to the general: the intelligence was wrong. The enemy is not broken. The enemy is everywhere, and they are stronger than ever. General Heinz Guderian, commanding the 2nd Panzer Army south of Moscow, watches his front collapse with a sense of dread. He realizes instantly that his exposed flanks are being enveloped. The very tactics of encirclement that he used to such devastating effect in the summer are now being turned against him. He tries to organize a mobile defense, but his tanks will not start. The engines are frozen solid blocks of metal. The Panzerwaffe, the pride of the Reich, is reduced to a collection of static pillboxes that are easily bypassed or destroyed by the mobile Soviet forces. The Luftwaffe, which ruled the skies in the summer, is largely absent. The freezing temperatures have grounded the German planes, their engines refusing to turn over and their mechanics unable to work on the exposed airfields. Meanwhile, the Red Air Force, operating from heated hangars in Moscow and utilizing aircraft designed for rugged conditions, takes to the sky. They strafe the retreating columns, bombing the narrow roads that are the only escape routes for the German army. The sound of Soviet engines overhead adds to the feeling of total abandonment among the ground troops. As night falls, the terror intensifies. The Siberians are masters of night fighting, infiltrating the German lines to slit throats and toss grenades into dugouts. The German soldiers, terrified of being cut off in the dark, begin to abandon their positions without orders. They leave behind their frozen heavy equipment, their artillery, and their wounded comrades. A chaotic retreat begins to take shape, not as a strategic maneuver, but as a flight for life. The roads westward become clogged with a disorderly mass of men and vehicles, all desperate to put distance between themselves and the Siberian vengeance. The scale of the counteroffensive is staggering. It is not a local attack but a strategic blow across a 500-mile front. From Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south, the Soviet pincers are snapping shut. The German Army Group Center, which had been poised to take Moscow, is suddenly fighting for its very existence. The hunter has become the hunted. The momentum of the war has shifted violently, and the initiative has passed from the invaders to the defenders. The psychological shock of this reversal is as damaging as the physical blows being landed by the Red Army. For the individual German soldier, the situation is a nightmare of freezing cold and confusion. He is hungry, frostbitten, and outgunned. He sees the subhuman enemy he was taught to despise, now advancing with superior equipment and morale. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated by propaganda and years of victory, shatters in the snowdrifts outside Moscow. He realizes that the war will not be over by Christmas. In fact, he begins to understand that he may never see Germany again. The retreat is a trudge through hell, harassed by skiers and Cossacks every step of the way. By the end of the first week of December, the threat to Moscow has been decisively smashed. The German army is reeling, pushed back dozens of miles in some sectors. The immediate danger to the capital has passed, replaced by the very real possibility of the destruction of Army Group Center. The mistake of underestimating the Soviet reserves and the Russian winter has culminated in a disaster. The Siberian hammer has fallen, and the Wehrmacht, frozen and broken, is being driven back into the white void from which there seems to be no escape. By the middle of December 1941, the German Army Group Center is teetering on the brink of a catastrophe that rivals the doom of Napoleon's Grande Armée in 1812. The strategic retreat, initially intended to be a controlled withdrawal to shorter and more defensible lines, is rapidly degenerating into a chaotic rout. Panic is infectious, spreading through the frozen ranks faster than the typhus that plagues them. Entire companies are dissolving as soldiers throw away their heavy machine guns and rifles to trudge faster through the deep snow. Desperate to escape the Siberian phantom nipping at their heels, the roads heading west are clogged with a disorganized mob of shivering men, broken vehicles, and terrified horses, all moving under the grim shadow of total annihilation. The German generals on the ground, seasoned professionals like Heinz Guderian and Fedor von Bock, view the situation with the cold logic of military science. They recognize that their armies are overextended, exhausted, and deployed in positions that are tactically indefensible against the Soviet counteroffensive. They unanimously agree that the only rational course of action is a deep withdrawal to the Smolensk line or the Mayas River. There, they argue, the army can find winter quarters, shorten their supply lines, rebuild their strength, and prepare for a renewed campaign in the spring. To stay where they are, in the open, frozen steppe with no fortifications, is to invite encirclement and destruction. However, hundreds of miles away, in the heated bunkers of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler views the situation through a prism of ideological fanaticism rather than military necessity. He holds his generals in deep contempt, believing their desire to retreat is a sign of cowardice and a lack of National Socialist will. He fears that a general withdrawal will turn into a disorderly flight that will destroy the army's heavy equipment and morale forever. On December 16, 1941, ignoring the desperate pleas of his field marshals, Hitler issues his infamous Haltebefehl, the halt order. The directive is absolute and chilling in its simplicity, not one step back. The order demands that the troops must hold their positions to the last man and the last round. Every village, every farmhouse, and every patch of ground must be converted into a fortress. Hitler explicitly forbids any voluntary withdrawal, regardless of the tactical situation or the threat of encirclement. He commands the soldiers to fanatical resistance, ordering them to dig in with artillery shells if they have no shovels, to create defensive lines out of the ice itself. The professional autonomy of the German officer corps, a tradition dating back to the Prussians, is instantly revoked. The war is no longer being run by generals, but by the iron will of the dictator. When this order reaches the front lines, it is met with a mixture of disbelief and horror by the commanders who are watching their men freeze to death. General Guderian, the father of the blitzkrieg, flies to Hitler's headquarters to personally argue for the survival of his troops. He describes the pitiable condition of his men, the lack of winter clothing, and the impossibility of digging in frozen ground that is hard as diamond. Hitler listens with a stone face and dismisses Guderian's concerns, accusing him of being too influenced by the suffering of the soldiers. Within days, Guderian is relieved of command, along with Hoepner and dozens of other senior officers. The purge of the generals has begun. For the common soldier, the halt order is a death sentence that must be obeyed. They are forced to stop their retreat in the middle of open fields where the temperature is -40 degrees, without heavy tools or explosives. Digging foxholes in the petrified earth is physically impossible. Desperate infantrymen resort to lighting fires to thaw the topsoil, scraping away a few inches of mud before the ground freezes again. When that fails, they use hand grenades to blast shallow craters in the ice, crouching inside them like animals, exposed to the wind and the enemy fire. They are building their own graves, holding a line that exists only on a map in Berlin. The tactical formation shifts from a continuous front to a series of isolated strongpoints known as Igelstellung, or hedgehog positions. German units fortify villages and towns, creating all-around defenses that bristle with weaponry like the spines of a hedgehog. These islands of resistance are often completely surrounded by the flowing tide of the Red Army. Inside these perimeters, the conditions are medieval. Soldiers crowd into the few remaining standing structures, sleeping in shifts to keep watching the dark horizon. They are cut off from the world, reliant on intermittent Luftwaffe airdrops for ammunition and meager food supplies. The Soviets, sensing the German desperation, launch wave after wave of attacks against these hedgehog positions. The fighting descends into a brutal close-quarters struggle for warmth and shelter. Red Army troops, clad in white, storm the burning villages, using flamethrowers to clear the Germans from the basements and ruins. The snow turns black with soot and red with blood. The Germans fight with the ferocity of trapped rats, knowing that surrender means almost certain death in a Soviet labor camp or immediate execution in the snow. The halt order, for all its cruelty, succeeds in stiffening the resistance simply because the men have nowhere else to go. To maintain these positions, the Wehrmacht resorts to a scorched earth policy of horrific proportions. As they are forced out of villages or choose to consolidate smaller perimeters, they burn everything that could offer shelter to the enemy. Special commando teams are assigned to torch peasant huts, barns, and granaries. The Russian civilians are thrown out into the blizzard, left to freeze and starve as their homes are consumed by flames. The smoke of burning villages stretches for hundreds of miles, a black curtain marking the line of the German defense. The war has shed its last vestige of civilized conflict and become a war of annihilation. Inside the freezing pockets, the medical situation collapses into a nightmare. With no way to evacuate the wounded, field hospitals become charnel houses. Gangrene spreads unchecked, and without anesthesia, surgeons perform amputations using saws lubricated with gasoline. Piles of severed limbs accumulate outside the medical tents, frozen solid. The wounded beg for death, and often Their comrades can offer them nothing but a cigarette and a look of helpless pity. The stand-fast order has stabilized the front. But the cost is paid in the limbs and lives of a generation of young German men. The psychological transformation of the German soldier during this period is profound. The arrogant confidence of the summer is replaced by a grim, nihilistic fatalism. They no longer fight for the glory of the Reich or the vision of the Führer. Those concepts have frozen and shattered in the Russian winter. They fight now for the man standing next to them, bound together by shared suffering and the primal instinct to survive. They develop a frontline brotherhood that excludes the high command, whom they view with increasing bitterness. They are the front swine, abandoned to the ice, tasked with holding the line against the entire world. Surprisingly, Hitler's gamble begins to pay off in a perverse way. The Red Army, exhausted by its own rapid advance and suffering from logistical overstretch in the terrible weather, begins to lose momentum. They smash themselves against the hedgehogs, taking heavy casualties for every village they liberate. The rigid German defense, anchored on key towns and road junctions, prevents the total collapse that seemed imminent in mid-December. The not-one-step-back order prevents a Napoleonic rout, but it bleeds the Panzerwaffe white, stripping it of the mobility that was its greatest asset. By late January, the front line resembles a jagged scar across the map of Russia, full of salients and pockets, but it is continuous. The great Soviet counteroffensive slows down as the Germans stubbornly refuse to break. The exhausted combatants stare at each other across a wasteland of snow and corpses, neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. The blitzkrieg is officially dead, buried in the drifts outside Moscow. In its place, a grinding war of attrition has emerged, a war that Germany, with its limited resources, cannot hope to win in the long run. The surviving generals, those who were not fired, look at the wreckage of their divisions and realize the magnitude of the mistake. They have saved the army from immediate destruction, but they have lost the strategic initiative forever. The Wehrmacht is no longer a precision instrument of mobile warfare. It has become a blunt object. Battered and defensive, they have held the ground, but they have lost the war's soul. The professional military judgment has been permanently subordinated to the intuition of a dictator, a shift that spells doom for the years to come. As the storms of January 1942 howl over the static front, the German soldier huddles in his ice-crusted foxhole. Watching the east, he has survived the typhoon, the mud, and the freeze. He has stood fast as ordered, but as he looks at the endless white horizon, he knows that the spring will bring only more blood. The quick victory is a fantasy. The reality is the ice, the lice, and the waiting death. Operation Typhoon has failed, and the long, slow defeat has begun. As the pale sun of early 1942 begins to linger longer in the sky, the great Russian winter slowly relinquishes its iron grip on the landscape outside Moscow. The thawing snow recedes, revealing a ghastly archaeology of the previous months, exposing the true cost of the failed offensive. The white blanket that had concealed the horror melts away to unveil a sprawling graveyard of the Wehrmacht's ambitions. Thousands of frozen corpses, preserved in the grotesque postures of their final moments, emerge from the drifts like statues returning to the earth. They lie alongside the twisted wreckage of Panzer IVs, Opel Blitz trucks, and artillery pieces, all rusting in the mud that is once again reclaiming the steppes. It is a panorama of devastation that stretches from Kalinin to Tula, a physical testament to the death of the blitzkrieg. The material losses for the German army are nothing short of catastrophic, crippling their offensive capabilities for months to come. In the span of a single winter campaign, the Wehrmacht has lost over 178,000 men killed or missing, with hundreds of thousands more evacuated due to sickness and horrific frostbite injuries. The equipment losses are equally staggering. Thousands of tanks, the cutting edge of the armoured divisions, sit as burnt-out hulks on the road to the capital. The motorized transport fleet has been decimated, with over 100,000 vehicles abandoned or destroyed by the cold. The highly mobile, mechanized army that invaded in June has been effectively demotorized, forced to rely once again on rail lines and exhausted horses to move supplies. For the survivors, The men who endured the deep freeze and held the line against the Siberian onslaught. The experience has fundamentally altered their psyche. They are no longer the fresh-faced, optimistic conquerors who marched into Poland and France singing victory songs. They are gaunt, hollow-eyed veterans who have stared into the abyss of total annihilation. To commemorate their survival, the High Command issues a new decoration, the Eastern Front Medal, the soldiers, with their characteristic gallows humour. Immediately christen it the Gefrierfleischorden, or the Order of the Frozen Meat. It is a ribbon worn not with pride, but with a cynical bitterness, a badge of membership in a fraternity of suffering that those in Berlin can never understand. The strategic reality of the war has shifted irrevocably, turning the conflict into the very scenario the German generals had feared most, a war of attrition. The failure to take Moscow and knock the Soviet Union out of the war in 1941 means that the Third Reich is now locked in a prolonged death struggle with a colossus. The mistake of believing the Red Army was broken, the hubris of ignoring the logistics of winter, and the arrogance of racial superiority have all conspired to trap Germany in a multi-front war it cannot win. With the entry of the United States into the conflict following Pearl Harbor, the industrial clock is now ticking against Berlin. The window for a quick, decisive victory has slammed shut, locked tight by the ice of the Moscow front. Adolf Hitler, deluded by his own propaganda and the partial success of his Holt Order, draws the wrong conclusions from the battle. He becomes convinced that his will alone saved the army from destruction, reinforcing his contempt for the professional military education of his generals. He cements his personal command over the army, dismissing the tactical expertise of men like Guderian and taking direct control of operations. This marks the end of the Auftragstaktik, the tradition of mission-type orders that allowed German officers flexibility in the field. From this point on, the war will be micromanaged from a bunker thousands of miles away, leading to rigid decisions that will doom the army in the years to follow. On the other side of the line, the Battle of Moscow serves as a forging fire for the Red Army, transforming it from a disorganized mass into a confident fighting force. The Soviet commanders and soldiers now know that the Germans are not invincible supermen, but mortal enemies who can be bled, frozen, and beaten. The successful defense of the capital saves the Stalinist regime and galvanizes the Soviet population. The factories behind the Urals are now churning out T-34 seconds and aircraft at a rate the Germans cannot match. The Siberian miracle was not just a stroke of luck, it was the awakening of an industrial giant that will eventually roll all the way to Berlin. The landscape around Moscow remains scarred and desolate, a grim reminder of the scorched earth policy employed by both sides. Hundreds of villages have been erased from the map, leaving only chimney stacks standing like tombstones among the ashes. The civilian population has suffered unspeakable horrors. Caught between the hammer of the invasion and the anvil of the defense, starvation and exposure have claimed more lives than the bullets, leaving a legacy of hatred that will fuel the savage nature of the conflict for the next 3 years. The war in the East has shed all pretense of conventional warfare. It is now a crusade of extermination, where quarter is neither asked nor given. As the spring mud dries, the German army prepares for a new offensive, but the focus has shifted away from the impregnable capital. The High Command turns its eyes south, towards the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad, hoping to strangle the Soviet economy since they could not decapitate its leadership. The veterans of Moscow look at the maps with skepticism, knowing that the easy victories are a thing of the past. They know that every mile of Russian territory will have to be paid for in blood. The army is still dangerous, still lethal, but the spirit of invincibility that drove Operation Typhoon has died in the snow. The logistical backbone of the Wehrmacht has been shattered and will never fully recover to its 1,941 levels. The elite panzer divisions have been diluted, their ranks filled with inexperienced replacements and captured equipment. The loss of thousands of trained non-commissioned officers, the glue that holds the army together, is a wound that cannot be healed. These men, who led by example and maintained discipline, lie buried in mass graves under the birch trees. Their loss degrades the tactical proficiency of the German units, making them more reliant on brute force and rigid orders rather than the fluid skill that characterized the early blitzkrieg. In retrospect, the winter of 1941 stands as the pivotal turning point of World War II in Europe. It was the moment when the irresistible force of the German war machine struck the immovable object of the Russian geography and will. The mistake was not a single tactical error, but a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy and the environment. The Germans calculated the war in terms of divisions and kilometers, failing to account for the spiritual and physical resilience required to fight at 40 below zero. They gambled everything on a house of cards that collapsed the moment the wind changed. For the German soldier standing guard in the spring of 1942, the spires of the Kremlin are no longer a tantalizing prize, but a mocking symbol of failure. They are visible, yet infinitely distant, separated by a barrier of blood and ice that can never be crossed. The dream of returning home by Christmas has been replaced by the grim certainty of a long, dark road ahead. He checks his rifle, cleans the mud from his boots, and looks to the east, where the sun is rising. He knows that the bear has been wounded, not killed, and that the coming summer will bring a fury even greater than the winter. The blitzkrieg is over. The lightning war, which relied on speed, shock, and quick collapse, has been suffocated by the vastness of the steppe. In its place is a grinding war of attrition, a contest of industrial output and manpower reserves that favors the Allies. The German army has survived the winter, but it has lost the war. The mistake of Moscow was the beginning of the end, a slow-motion catastrophe that will drag on for 3.5 more years, consuming millions of lives, before ending in the rubble of Berlin. Ultimately, the Battle of Moscow proved that the Wehrmacht could be stopped. It shattered the myth of German invincibility in the eyes of the world, giving hope to occupied Europe and the Allies. It demonstrated that machines, no matter how advanced, are subject to the laws of nature, and that logistics are the true arbiter of victory. The German generals who looked at their maps in October and saw victory were blinded by their own brilliance. Unable to see the storm gathering on the horizon, they marched into a trap set not just by Zhukov, but by history itself. As the documentary fades from the thawing battlefields of 1942, we are left with the image of a single German helmet, rusted and half buried in the mud, a wildflower blooming through a crack in the steel. It is a silent memorial to the hubris of an empire that reached too far, and the terrible price paid by the men sent to execute that impossible vision. The wind blows across the open plains, carrying the whispers of the fallen, a haunting reminder of the winter when the world held its breath, and the tide of history turned in the snow.